We're unmuted and we are live. There we go.
All right. Welcome everybody to the 16th production review slash live stream for
It's just
Royals and
Royals and
Rogues.
Rogues live now. We're no longer just
We're not gonna
productions.
do I mean,
It's
yeah,
Rogues live.
maybe
Welcome
not
to
this
Royals
week,
and Rogues live.
but
We're gonna be like 2000. It's like welcome to the 2000s. Like it's
yeah,
just welcome to Royals and Rogues
that's
live.
right.
Just
No,
that
that's
simple.
right. It's gonna be 2000. I'm gonna keep count.
Okay.
And then I'm gonna start doing 2000.1 and we'll just start adding decimals onto it. So,
Oh
but this
goodness.
week we are gonna be talking about a concept that Alec and I have been kicking around, and it's the idea of how really the title, Growing Up Isn't Selling Out, and how that actually looks like when you're trying to make projects. A good way for us is that both of us have full-time jobs in addition to this. So we're not sitting here spending all day, every day working on our projects, which does make it slower, but then also means that we have to make adjustments themselves. But Alec, go ahead and kick off. What exactly, because you originally came up with this, it was
Right.
something that was really kicking around in your head.
Yeah. So my whole goal with this channel is to help artists. I'm gonna say this pretty much every episode until people start like really getting that is like that's how I'm trying to brand myself, I guess, or whatever. Is I'm here to like empower the creatives in the world. And um there's this problem that happens if you're a creative person. And I'm sure, like, I don't know if you've heard this, Rob, when you went to film school, but I heard this multiple times, which was like kind of this idea of like, oh, that's cool, but like, maybe you should grow up. Or other people will tell me, oh yeah, I really loved making movies, or oh yeah, I was into photography, or oh yeah, I used to be a graphic designer or whatever, or and then they're like, but I grew up. And it really rubs me the wrong way when somebody says that, because there's all sorts of things. And what really triggered is I was watching an interview and someone was talking to someone that had a kind of more like idealistic beliefs about like politics and stuff like that. And the person was like, oh yeah, I really loved your writing, I really loved all of your theories, but like I kind of grew up. And that was like a repeated thing. They took great offense at it, and they're like, what do you mean you grew up? Out of my recommendations that we can have a better world, that we can like improve this stuff. And it was like, well, realistically, and all this other stuff that people like to hide behind. And that really rubbed me the wrong way. So I started thinking about it more and more. And it's like, well, why do people associate selling out, right, giving up on their dreams or their ideals that they had when they were younger or in college, with growing up? Because I like was talking to my wife about it, and I'm like, well, I'm an adult. I'm more or less a grown up, like, but I haven't given up on my dreams. And so why is that? And what does it mean to grow up with your dreams, right, rather than growing up out of your dreams? And I think there's a lot of lessons to learn about this as you start thinking about it. But I think one thing that you need to do as you grow up, if you're a creative person, and is start to realize, like, yeah, you're not gonna be what you thought you were going to be. It's not going to look like the way you thought it was going to look like. So a lot of people think like, well, we're going to be movie stars, we're going to be rock stars, we're going to be whatever. And then they start to realize the chances of that happening and how rare it is and how much work it is. And I think that's where the whole like, well, I grew up, right? I realized that wasn't going to happen. And that's true. Like, that part of it's kind of true. It's like, it's not going to happen the way you thought it was going to happen, where you just get discovered by somebody one day and then you're suddenly famous. However, the other way to grow up, rather than just saying, well, that's not going to happen, is going, okay, well, that's not going to happen, but then what could it look like? Or what would I need to do as a serious person, now that it's an adult, to make that dream a reality?
So if I understand, because again, we've kicked this around a couple times, but to kind of make sure I understand it sounds like what you're saying is along the lines of like growing. We talk about growing up when you're talking about kind of an artist or pretty much anyone who's young,
Right.
growing up, and you kind of have to accept that you're not going to be whatever your dream is necessarily. But then there's also the flip side of someone who really chases after their dreams, and you think of it like a musician who signs with a record label or something, and we all will consider that selling out at the same time.
Right.
And that there's actually neither of those is necessary, to really put it that way. It's that like growing up as an artist doesn't mean you have to find some sort of job security of like, oh, I'm going to go do a corporate job where I'm doing boring stuff and I hate it, even if you're
Right.
going to be doing an artist like what you're doing. But it's also not the same thing as you got to completely disregard what you wanted to do long term.
Right.
It's almost like you have to, because from my perspective, from what I did is I originally wanted to work in film, and when I first started, I wanted to be a director,
Hmm.
and then and I liked writing a lot. I still do a lot of writing. Um, but I kind of over time, just within college, learned that I actually enjoyed running film sets
Hmm.
just as much, and there was less competition to do that. So I kind of looked at it and said, okay, well, I enjoy doing this. Sure, it's considered below the line,
Hmm.
but I will at least get more chances to do the work and be successful in that.
Right.
And then I went out to LA and spent like a year and hated it. I was like, okay, this is not for me. Like I realized that most people, there's maybe 15 people who actually make decisions in Los Angeles, like in Hollywood, and that's all the people who control the money, and everybody after that is just a hanger on. And I
Right.
kind of just sat there and kept thinking, even if I was a writer or a director, it's going to be up to other people what gets made and what doesn't. And I'd rather just be able to like make my own stuff. And
Right.
so I just kind of took it more seriously and said, okay, well, what is it, if I want to be doing this, what is it that I need to be doing? Like, what is it that I have to have? And so for me, I said, okay, well, I need to have the money and sufficiency to be able to do that. So I have to be able to at least pay for myself and then have extra money to pay for whatever projects or whatever I'm working on, help fund that, at least initially. And so then I kind of sat down and put actionable steps into place and figuring out what to do to execute them. So for me, it was okay, I'm going to leave and work in a different industry that does pay better, but I'm going to become really good at that and for working in that field. But then I can take that extra money that I have or that extra time that I have later and then fund projects or work on projects like I said initially, and then the goal is to make them good enough that they are self-sufficient from that point on moving forward.
Right. Right.
And that those projects themselves can generate money. But that's actually something where it takes a lot of work to sit down and say, here are the specific steps that I'm going to take, and I'm going to, because this is my dream, I have to take it seriously. I can't just be like, oh, well, it's just going to happen magically one day. It's like, no, no, no. I have to take little steps every single time I'm working on it to get to this point that I'm going to be at. Is
Right.
that kind of,
So what I'm trying to get at is like, um, there's multiple levels to this thing, right? So one level is the idea of growing up being, I think you kind of put it as like becoming self-sufficient, right? In our when we were talking about this, and that's how you should essentially be able to provide for yourself and your loved ones. And the idea is like, well, I grew up because I realized that this wasn't going to happen, that wasn't going to enable that, right? So I grew up, so I prioritized, my life and security and all these things over doing this thing. And then what happens is, um, you know, the dream ends up dying in service of something else, right? And I think one of the problems is a lack of creativity. So what you're talking about is a few things. One is taking your dreams more seriously, but maybe less literally. This is something I've been on with a lot of things. But when it comes to your dream, it's like, okay, am I literally gonna be, a famous film director one day? Like,
mhm.
maybe not, right? Am I literally gonna be whatever? But then we can ask yourself, it's like, well, what did I really want there? Like, what did I really want? What was my dream really? I'm gonna take it more seriously rather than leaving it this vague thing that's in the sky. Adult, as I become a grown up, rather than saying, oh, that's only for kids or only for like crazy people or idealists or people that get lucky, it's like, let me take that more seriously. What does that look like? What could it look like that I would enjoy? And then what you can do is get creative with it. And so, it's kind of this two-step process. And so one option is to go like, okay, well, what do I really want to do? What I really want to do is kind of like tell stories and make film, right? What's a way I can achieve that in my life where I'm at, right? And then what would that look like? And so one aspect of that is, well, I could, and then you get creative. Like there's a bunch of creativity that can happen where you can go to kind of take your path, right? Which is like, I'm going to go and try to become financially independent enough to then loop back to this, right? And do it on my own terms. Um, And then it's not so much riding on it. There's not so much pressure, but I'm never giving up on that thing. I'm never growing up. You wouldn't say I grew up and so I stopped becoming a filmmaker. You said I grew up, so I realized in order to become a filmmaker, bashing my head against, the Hollywood stars isn't going to do it. I'm going to have to find another path to this, right? So I do think there's a part of growing up that's important where you should recognize this. Okay, this dream's not going to happen the way I thought it was going to happen. Right.
Yeah.
But then you can go, okay, what could it look like, and what's an option that I could figure out, and how can I exercise my creativity to get there, right? So, what like I came to realize was like, okay, I started this whole thing. I went to film school and I did all this because I wanted to make cool stuff. That's more or less it. Like I just want to make cool images that I liked. And then you end up working for other people, and then you go, okay, I don't want to work for other people, so I quit. And so I'm going to start my own thing. So then you start your own business, and you're running your own business. You're like, well, I'm still working for clients. What I really wanted to do was make cool stuff. Like, okay, how can I do that? And it's like, well, Hollywood's not going to fund it, right? And it's like, well, we have this cool thing called YouTube. Maybe I can put it out there. And maybe what I could do is find different parts of it, to monetize in different ways, or to try to build an audience, or try to do whatever. There's all sorts of things you can do that isn't the one tried and true route. And I think that's what happens when people grow up, is they go like, look, the one option I thought I had isn't the option. And like you said, the other thing they do is they go like, well, the only way I'm going to be able to do this is if I do it through this corporate means, right? And that's where really the selling out really comes in. Isn't just giving up on your dreams, but it's this idea of, I'm going to not only, I'm left with this binary choice, right? I either give up my dreams, or I, like you were saying, like I go and work for Hollywood, and I go work for somebody that I actually don't have any creative control, but it kind of looks like what I want, and I'm giving someone else the power to like say whether or not I get to do it, right? And how I get to do it. And there's a lot of ways that looks like, that looks like, right? It looks like, I guess a record deal for some people, and for some people, it doesn't. I think you mentioned a Real Big Fish, right?
Yeah. Real Big Fish. They were a ska band. And I remember their first album is called I think it's called Sell Out, but their big hit was called Sell Out,
right,
which is all about selling out to a record label to get radio play. And of course, no radio station was going to play them,
right,
because it's all about selling out. It's like, okay, this does not make us look good. So they never got major radio play, but they went on to have a huge career. Like they still tour to this day.
right.
And it's like, yeah, okay, well, that's how we're going to make our money, is going around touring, which is where bands make most of their money generally. So yeah, that was always one that stood out to me.
Right. And I don't know if they ever got a record deal or not. But I think one of the things I think is interesting is the idea of we have this idea, right, that you're selling out if you're not doing it for the sake of doing it, right? If you're not doing something for the purity of the art. And there's a practical side that always that shows up, right? And someone goes like, well, practically we have to do this, or practically we have to do that. And that's true if you're going to do it in that way, right? So like if you want to make a feature film that's shown in theaters around the globe, the idea that you're going to do it outside of a studio, any sort of studio, is probably not going to happen, right? Mm-hmm. But then what you can do is you can say, okay, well, so practically, like realistically, guys, we're going to have to sell something to whoever, right? We're going to have to make a deal with Netflix or whatever. And people would consider that like the grown-up decision, right? That's like, hey, look, like let's talk about, we're all adults here. We understand that nobody gets to just be completely independent all the time, right? But I think that's sort of a myth, right? And so, we talked about the idea of finding other ways, which I think is one important aspect of it. The other thing is changing kind of the maybe not even the scope, but the focus of like, what is it I'm really trying to do? And I think a third idea, and this goes along kind of with the other two, is like changing the audience, right? So there's the idea of, I can change you have to look at like what you can control, right? I can control the scope of my idea. Like what do I actually want to focus on? What is important to the story I want to tell, or where it's going to be shown. I can change the way I go about it, right? Like, or I could change who I'm talking to. And that's one of the most interesting ones to me is I think we're all obsessed with sort of this global stage, right? And so there's this idea, if you have a band, and you ask yourself like, well, I want to be a rock star. It's like, well, why? You want to be a rock star because you want to be famous, because you want to have a ton of people watch you, because you want your name known, or do you want it because you like making music? And if you like making music, what's not the end of the world is rather than trying to be famous and be, and sell it to a record, you could be like, well, I'm going to change my audience to be a local thing, right? I'm going to choose something smaller. I can play at the local bar on Thursdays or whatever day they have live music. And you can be a local band. And the irony is, oftentimes I find that's the actual venue to get to where you want to go. So by changing your audience focus is another way that you can kind of change this whole thing. And I've noticed, I've been studying independent filmmaking and comic books and publishing a lot, because that's essentially what we're doing, as independent filmmakers right now. And one of the things that I've really noticed about independent like comics and a lot of artists is like a lot of times what they can do is they just by finding a niche that is not mass market, they're finding an audience that's been underserved, right? That then actually values what they make more. And so it's really interesting that you can make something that's like not nearly as high quality as a feature film or a like studio produced song, and not nearly as big maybe, right, as bombastic, but the audience is willing to kind of pay more for it because it's specifically catered to them. And
Well,
so go on.
I was gonna say there's a recognition I found with a lot of people, is that you expect you expect the best from large studios that have the most money.
Right.
Like you have the money to not make mistakes. You should not make mistakes. For small content creators, where it's like us, it's like I know this is something that I mean, fight's probably not the right word, but we've definitely uh
Yeah, they had
really
to
hammer
work
this
out.
point
Yeah.
home, is like the idea of, okay, perfection, how good is good enough, and except coming to this conclusion of like, okay, is this good enough? Okay, we can move on.
Right.
And I can actually say, since we have been working on Tycho Decay, it's been pretty impressive how you've been able to kind of move around to that of like, oh, this is actually good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect. And because it makes, I think this is also, and I hate that I don't know how I don't take compliments and I'll get, but one thing that it's been interesting is that as you do tutorials and or we've talked, you'll sit there and start doing something. I'm like, hey, can you explain this? Because I don't know what you're talking about. And then you'll start going through this whole explainer about this one system or how this
Mm-hmm.
works, and I'll just be like, okay, that's pretty impressive. And then your response is usually like, oh, well, I feel like I don't really know a lot. It's like,
Right.
no, that's actually a lot you do. You're at the tutorial show that we do, you know quite a lot about a lot of different systems, and it's impressive. And so as audience members, people can watch something and be like, yes, this probably could be better in X, Y, and Z, but understanding this person probably doesn't have the time or the money to do all of that. This is impressive what they've been able to do. And then you give leeway for that, which is kind of nice. It's kind of like you talk about underserved communities
Mm-hmm.
or groups of people and what they like. It's the same thing as like, oh, yes, underserved, I will take whatever I can get, and I can, especially at certain times, for people who know what they're doing, they can recognize, oh, this is actually someone who's talented, but just didn't have the resources to get it done. Or this was a
Right.
good idea that couldn't get the complete perfect execution, but that means that if they did have the resources, they would be able to do it.
Yeah, I think that's an important part of it is like realizing, and sort of like the right scope of any project is like how small do you need to make it to actually do it, right? So it's like how much, like when someone comes, no one comes to me and asks this, but if you were to go to a fitness coach, right, and you say, how much should I lift? They'd be like, well, how much can you lift? Right?
Yeah.
It would be like, oh, what's your bench, right? Or whatever it is. And so or your squat or your whatever. And so you're going to sit there and go like, well, my, I don't know. And so it's like, okay, let's try to lift something heavy. And it's like, I can't lift, 200 pounds. It's like, okay, let's knock it down to 150. And it's like, still no. And it's like, all right, let's put it down to whatever. And eventually you might just be lifting the bar, right? Which is like 45 pounds or whatever standard dumbbell bar is. So it's like, okay, so that's where you're starting then. You're starting at just that. And so, rather than having these like crazy dreams that then you look at and you go, well, I'm never going to achieve that. And I just grew up and I became realistic. I was never going to be famous. I was never going to be able to be a marathon runner or whatever it is. It's like, okay, well, that's fine. Don't grow out of your dreams, grow like into them. Right. So you should go from trying to jump from like little teenage you to film, auteur from that to, well, I can't get there. That's not going to happen. But I can jump from like little teenage me to like my first short film, and it's going to suck and it's going to be bad. And then I can jump to like, a decent film. And then I can, you can start getting those reps in. And that's what I think the right way to grow up into any ideal is, right? Like, and not grow out and not just go like, well, instead of me trying to figure out how to accomplish my dream, I'm going to either, sell it to somebody else and then let them help me out and kind of push me to the forefront, or I'm going to, I'm going to give up on it.
Another part that goes along with that, which I think is actually what stood out, is I remember a lot of people who said that they wanted to do film,
Mm-hmm.
or something along those lines, who I went to school with, and a lot of people who, they were doing film and then they went out to LA and then they wanted to be actors,
Right.
and you just kind of like you kind of understood and knew who was serious and who wasn't.
Right.
And it was all these most of the time it was people who they didn't really care about being actors. They just wanted to be famous.
Right.
Um, and I knew early on, I was like, I knew early on I don't want to be famous.
Right.
Um, I'd prefer not. Like the idea of someone stopping me maybe once or twice sounds kind of nice, and it's like, oh, you enjoy it, that's
Right.
great. But the idea of like you're getting, seen everywhere, that type of fame type of thing, just yeah, it's not something I'd ever want to live with. Um, and that's actually kind of how I came to the conclusion that I enjoy the thing for what it is. Like I
Right.
enjoy the storytelling for what that is, and I want to be able to do that because it's similar to what you're talking about growing up, is I realized that I just have to periodically sit down and do something.
Right.
Um, and we've even talked about this, like what is the ideal way of doing it? Like on the short, is
Mm-hmm.
it better to do it on one day? Take one day and dedicate that day. Is it better to do it a couple of hours each day over the week? But it's similar to like learning any instrument or um, really any skill. It doesn't really matter how much time you actually put into it. You just have to be putting in some time. It's like
Right.
I've been getting back into piano, and some days I will sit down and I will play for like 10 minutes. And it's because that's how long it's taking for, my food to cook. So I'll
Right.
sit down and just play a little bit, and it's right next to my kitchen, so it's right there. But that's it, just 10 minutes. But that's if I do that for multiple days in a row, I'm building upon that. Or it could be where I sit down and I'll have like a Sunday afternoon and I'll just practice for a couple hours. Just doing it is the fact of doing it, but it's the actual skill of growing discipline to do that thing. That's
Right.
part of the growing up aspect
Well,
of
I
it,
I
is like,
also I also think that if you're in it for the goal, for the results, right? Then you're not. What's what you saw in Hollywood? All your friends that went for Hollywood. It's like you're never gonna stick with it
yeah,
if you're in it for the results, because the results are gonna be so far away that you're gonna give up, right? You're gonna be sitting there. There's a wonderful, wonderful song. I absolutely love it to death called "Dying in L.A." And it's just very accurate. It's just like yeah, when nobody cares that when you're dying in LA. Nobody's there when you're like not famous, when you're just sitting there losing all your money, not being able to pay rent, like going through the city. And it's like there's all the beautiful people, there's all the riches, there's all the stuff that you could get. And if that's why you're doing it though, hey, it's gonna lead you to take shortcuts. It's gonna lead you to sell out. It's gonna lead you to backstab other people and do all the other stuff that we all hate when people do it. But it's also gonna you're not gonna stick with it long enough to get through the suck, right? Like there's this large section of suck, and that's where I think you either have to do like one of three things, right? One, you sell out, right, and you backstab or you do whatever you have to do. You sleep with the director, whatever it is, right? Two, you give up, right, and then say, well, I grew up, but really you gave up. I think we could say growing up isn't giving up. That's another way to put this. I think that might have been my original thesis before I said growing up isn't selling out. And then the third one is you find a new path, right? You find your own ladder and you stick with it until you get there,
Yeah. Well, similar to that too is I know the few people who were successful in film from college that I worked with were the people who typically, not always, but like writers, the writers were the ones who, now this is anecdotal. They had already been married, so they already did have a, and they were working full-time jobs, but they had kind of a social aspect taken care of. But they were the ones who they didn't go out like on a Friday night when most other people were going out. Like, hey, let's go get a bar. Let's go, like, not just partying, but like, let's just go get a beer and do blah blah. They'd be like, oh no, I have to go home and work, and because I'm going to be writing. So they would work a full-time job and then go home and then spend all those times that you would normally be socializing doing the extra work and trying to get further along in that. So there is an aspect of that. Like, yeah, no one recognizes the sacrifices that you're making. When you're doing it.
Right.
They look at you like you're an idiot, or they think you're crazy, or they think it's a waste of time. It's only once you are successful and you are doing it well that then people will be like, oh wow, like that person was great. They knew what they were doing. It's like no one thinks you're a genius at the time.
Right.
It's always only at the end of the race that when people are like, oh wow, that was really good.
Well, and you don't know, especially with art, one of the hard parts is like you don't know if what you're doing is quote unquote worth it, right? Like you don't know what the audience reception is going to be. You don't know if your script is going to be something that sells, right? Like, and so that's another reason why you have to love it for the sake of loving it, for the sake of doing it. You just have to do it because you want to do it. And if you're concerned with, is this going to do well? It's like, well, you can't really know if it's going to do well. Like I said, no one sets out to make a bad film. No one sets out to make a flop. Like everyone does market research. Everyone tries to make the most money from their film. Like nobody's sitting here going like, oh, I hope our film does okay. Everyone's like, oh, it's going to make bank. And then everyone will tell you, like everyone around you, like this is going to be a hit. This is going to be great. People are going to love this. And like the answer is it's completely opaque. You don't actually know. Anything could happen at any moment to make it not do that, right? You could have a film, painting firefighters in like maybe a bad light or something like that. And it's really deep and interesting. And then 9/11 happens and it's like, well, we're never releasing this film. This is now dead. Like we can't release a film that bad mouths firefighters, right? Or maybe it's just the main character's a firefighter and he's like a scumbag. He cheats on his wife or something like that. No longer allowed to be released. Instead it's going to be Ladder 11 or whatever it is, where it's just like a love letter to firefighters. That could happen. And then, so it's like, well, I had to have made it had to be worth it just to do it. Right. For the sake of doing it. And I think it's interesting because I think it's one of the reasons why your married friends kind of had an advantage is if you're married, and especially if you have a kid, you have already been forced to do that at least once, right? You've been forced to be like, I'm going to take care of this kid, even though there's no benefit in the short term. There's no, like, I don't know, this kid's going to grow up to be a greatest thing ever, or he's going to grow up to be, hate me. I don't know. I just have to completely and utterly give myself to this kid and feed him and wake up and do the hard thing, show up every day, whether or not. It's not an option to not do it. That's it. That's that simple. And so, and same thing if, to a certain extent, if you're married and you're a good spouse, you have trained into you already, this idea of like, I'm committed to this for the sake of being committed to it, like not because of what I get, not because of what I'm hoping to receive on the other side of it. Like, if sickness and health, right? If she's sick for 3 weeks, I'm gonna have to be there for 3 weeks. If she's sick for 3 years, I have to be there for 3 years. Like, I have to just go through it and do it for the sake of the thing itself. And then there's this sort of magical side of it, which is on the other end. Usually it ends up in a better place, right? Usually the kid does grow up. Usually the kid does end up being kind of cool. And usually the kid like is healthy and happy, right? Like usually, this magic also kind of happens with films and stuff. Like if you do the love of it for the sake of it well, if you play your music and you play it well and you practice and you just are doing it because you want to do it, at the end of that, sometimes there's something great. And it may not be, and this is why you can't be too concerned with the outcome, because it may not be this amazing outcome. It may not be equivalent to the amount of hours you put in. One of the things that's crazy to me is how many times I study artists and, like I said, these independent like comic book writers or whatever, and like they're so much better than the mainstream thing, which is another topic I want to talk about at some point, not right now. But there's so many times where you're like, there's a little book, I think it's either Image or Dark Horse, I don't know which one at the moment, called The Witches, and it's this amazing story. It's really dark, and it's sort of about this town that has these sort of witches in the woods, and you can sacrifice something to the witches. It has to be something close to you, something you really love, and then you can get something in return. And so it's sort of this whole story of everyone's doing this, making these deals with the devil, and who is and who isn't, and who can you trust. It's really, really well done. It's brilliant, but it's very small. It's only known among like comic book people. Meanwhile, like, there's the biggest selling comics are often just like trite kind of nonsense a lot of times, right? And the same thing with film. There's all sorts of really great little films that I love and other people love, and what's breaking down the box office or blowing up the box office is often like Thor: Love and Thunder or something like that, and you're like, this sucks. And then
that one didn't do too well.
I don't know
actually.
how well that one did, but you get what I'm saying.
That one did not do well.
You get what I'm saying, right? Like something like it will do really well, right? Even like, Deadpool, right? Like you're like, okay, it's just like this irreverent kind of stupid, like, and like, don't get me wrong, I like Deadpool, I think it's fun, but like there's all sorts of films people are bleeding for, right, that are not doing as well as it, that deserve it, right? So and so like whenever I look at that, I'm like, okay, they put in way more effort, right? They put in way more like blood and passion and love into this project, and it didn't come out to be as good. But I don't think you can sit there and go like, well, then I should never have done it, right? And it's not worth it. Like that's a very like a weird way of looking at something, that the results, are the only reason to do something. Is if I can get something of equal quality back or more. Is such a transactional way to look at your life and art and like and everything else. Like it's like that's not how it works always, but you have to do it because you love doing it, for the passion of doing it, because and that's why we started doing this. That's what's funny, right? Like you didn't necessarily, some people started maybe from like the very beginning, like I just want to be famous, but like most of us got into some form of art as a kid, especially just because we like drawing. Like you weren't drawing to get a reward for drawing, right? And it would almost become work if you did, right? It would become like a job if you were like, well, I'm doing this to get something out of it. Doing something for the sake of doing it is kind of why we do it as a child. We get into something because we go, I like drawing pretty pictures. And you said, well, what are you going to hope to get out of that, kid? They're going to be like, what? I want to draw. Like, or I want kids just walk around singing. And you're like, oh, are you trying to become famous? You want to get an audience? Are you trying to build and they're like, no, I enjoy singing for the sake of singing. And there's a quote from Alan Watts, which is like, true virtue is unaware that it's virtue. And I think that's really what I'm talking about here, is like the idea of being virtuous, of not selling out, is part of it is just doing it because it calls to you need to be done, right? And not because of what you're hoping to get. And there's this amazing freeing like ability then, like you were talking about earlier with like, you don't have to have this like quality standard that's up here, because I'm not doing it for the end result. I'm not doing it for the quality. I'm doing it because I love doing it. And part of loving doing it is completing it. Like that's part of singing a song, is finishing the song or writing a book. But you have to do it partly because you love the process.
Yeah. It's interesting. As you're talking, I glanced down at my glass that I'm drinking out of.
Mhm.
It's for Ballast Point.
Oh, I love those guys. Oh,
Do
and
you
my cat.
remember when Ballast Point? Well, that's the thing. Ballast Point used to be good, and
Uh-oh.
then, but that's the thing
Did they
is,
sell?
so
Did they sell to a larger thing?
years ago now, Ballast Point, it was great beer, like fantastic. They were doing great, and then they sold their Sculpin IPA was just incredible, like just flying off the
Right.
shelves, super expensive because they just had so little of it. Um, they sold for $1 billion
Cool.
to um Anheuser-Busch,
Hmm.
and it was shocking because like Four Peaks out there, Four Peaks is
Right.
now owned by Anheuser-Busch,
Yeah,
but
I heard that.
they haven't changed to like they didn't change the Ballast Point stuff because they started making it so much larger.
Hmm.
It's like, well, your ingredients went down. They weren't using
Right,
the
right.
best
The batch,
ingredients.
yeah, right. The
The
batch
beer
changed,
actually,
right.
yeah, like the actual beer did change where people started going like, you know what? I I remember this being better and it's not worth the price point. And so there was a big change for that. But it was like, yeah, it's like they started the beer company, the brewery, because they loved brewing beer. That's what most people doing, beer at this point is doing is they start as just a thing at home and then they kind of get a little bit bigger, and then they go from there.
Right.
But it's the same type of thing where it's like, yeah, like selling out was great for them. They made money. That's fantastic. But it's kind of like the legacy of the brand suffered because I've never once in the past 4 or 5 years thought to myself, yeah, I really could use Ballast Point, even though I really did like
Right.
and still probably still would like some of their beer. It's just not something I'm going to search for or
Well,
ask for.
there is a siren song, so that we're getting a slightly off the original premise. But that's fine because we said what we needed to say on it, and we could wrap up on this. But um, resisting selling out is really important, and I can't think of a better example today, based off of what happened yesterday when this is going live. Is um, Activision Blizzard just fired just under 2,000 employees, right? And
Mhm.
in one day, right? And then all that stuff. And it's like, I made a ironic tweet, which was, thank goodness for Microsoft's management and money. Otherwise, how would they keep their employees and projects running, right? And it's like, you know, you have this thing, and it's running well. That's why they want to buy it, is because it's working, right? And then they buy it, and then like 6 months to, or maybe it's been a couple of years now, later they like go and fire half the staff, right? And you're like, okay, so what's the point then of partnering with this larger, bigger company, right? Like that has more money than they have like $3 trillion or something like this, and you're like, oh, okay, well that doesn't actually guarantee success, and so there's this myth. That's always tempting, and it's sort of the myth of any large organization, but especially like governments and big corporos like this is like, well, if I can just harness some of their like their size and their power, right? They have the scope that like then my thing will be more successful. I can get into that, and well, think of all the stuff we'll be able to do. And then the answer is like almost always the opposite. Almost always it's not. Well, look, now we have the resources to make our drink better. Now we have the resources to make this thing better. It's almost always 9 times out of 10 the death of whatever it is, right? Like,
Well,
and I always say, as soon as a company goes public, it dies, right? It's like
yeah,
it's no
yeah.
longer what it was. It's no longer serving. You're not doing it to do it anymore. You're doing it as soon as you go public. Instantly, your meaning, the reason why you exist, becomes about profit. And that's never the reason, not never, but very rarely the reason anyone necessarily started the thing. Especially any of these things that are
Yeah.
brilliant. Any of the things that are brilliant, a brilliant restaurant or brilliant whatever, it exists because you love making food, and then you go public, and the moment you do, it means now you exist to make money. Like by law in America anyway, you exist to make money now. And for your shareholders. And the same thing happens when you sell to a corporation is, it went from being about making video games to making money. You're an investment. We put 2 billion or 4 billion or whatever, $18 billion into you, and we want to see that back. And we're losing money on these people. So we're going to fire them, right? Because it's a bad year. And it's
Well,
like,
it's yeah.
that you lost the soul. You lost why you did the thing. And the same with Ballast Point. It's like we want to make quality beer, and then they get bought, and it's like, well, you need to make quantity beer. because we want to see quantity. And so then they go, okay, well, I guess we'll have to do that now. And then it drops in quality. And then it's like, there should be a point where someone goes, this isn't why we exist. We existed to make quality beer. We no longer are serving our purpose, and we need to shut it down, right? Like that's essentially what I believe should happen to most things is if it can't serve its purpose, you should close it, right? And then someone else can come in and fill that spot.
Well, you can also though, and I will say, and yeah, I don't disagree with you on a lot of that. I do think though that it can be pointed out that Activision Blizzard had not been doing gangbusters with their most recent stuff. Like they had turned into kind of a cash grab company as it is.
Right.
And the minute they got bought by Microsoft, it's like, okay, I'm pretty sure they'll find. Typically with mergers, is you find
sometimes there's a it's the what's it called again? It's the symptom, not the cause, right?
For sure. Yeah.
The cause might be they already lost their direction, which is why they sold out, right? Like that's
for sure.
That could also be the case, right? Like I'm not saying it's only one direction ever.
Well, and it's also it's one of those things where the year, people hired way too much during the pandemic because they kind of saw. It was weird that a lot of companies were like, oh, this is clearly the future. It was like, well, it's not supposed to be. But then it was also on top of that, it was people were looking for jobs, so you kind of had wages down a little bit. And then you have certainly when you're bought by a larger company, you go through a merger like that or an acquisition, that company already has some of those departments. Like their HR department is already like they have a lot of these departments already created. They don't need that redundant. So they need to get rid of that because it's like, well, then why? Like, we'll incorporate it, but that still means we already have the infrastructure for this. We don't need to do it the opposite way. So it is one of those things where it's like, like I completely agree with you. You just kind of come out of that, and it's like I don't think that either company is focused on making the best products, aside from to then drive the most profit.
Right.
And it should be said, coming from a producer role, yes, we want to make profit. But it's like you said, there is a factor of like, okay, how far is too far?
You do this all the time, right? Where you have the profit is in service of getting to continue to do this thing.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So like you've asked before when we look at like hiring Lucent, let's say, right, who's doing the animation or whatever, and I go, hey, I'd like to hire these guys. And you go, okay, how much is it gonna cost? And I say it's gonna cost this much. You go, is that gonna result in a better product that we want to have? And it's like, yeah, for these 5 or 6 reasons. And it's like, okay, let's do it. Right. And versus if I were to say, it's not going to result in a better product, but my ego would feel really good. Right. Then you would probably say like, hey, no. Or if I said it's not going to be a better product, but it's just going to make us a ton of money, you might also say no. Right. Like, the fact is you're looking at it going like, this is going to be a better product, then yes.
Well, the legs were a great example.
Right.
We were not going to go forward with the legs until who was it who had been working?
Sam.
Sam. It was Sam. Until Sam was like, "Oh, I already have legs." I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, then that makes it a lot easier." Because if we hadn't, it would have cost us to have functioning legs that can be rigged up. It would have cost us like a couple $1,000s just to get that done. Then to have Lucent do their own work. So that was something where it was like it was very fortuitous to us.
Right.
But because at the beginning we knew where it's like, okay, well then we'll have to work around it and deal with that.
Right. And the legs would have been a whole
sense.
setback, right? Because it's like, we wanted to be in a different part of production, and it would have been like, well, we're back at modeling, right? So we're going backwards. We're doing all this other stuff. So there's all sorts of reasons. But like you were saying, like it was in service of how much is this going to benefit the project, and is it going to be noticeable? And those are the criteria you should make decisions on. And then like third or fourth or fifth should be like, and then let's look at the profitability of this, right?
Yeah.
But the idea that like, I think our whole world, oddly enough, has somehow, you're not going to find somebody that's more of a capitalist than I am. However, the point of it is freedom and not just to gain capital. I use this example of analogy of wishes, right? So it's like if you get a magic lamp and it's like, here's a genie in a magic lamp. What should you wish for? Everyone goes, so you should wish for more wishes. Yeah. Right? That's what everyone says. Well, that's actually not what you should wish for. That's what you should wish for if you can always wish for more wishes if you and if you can use more than one wish. If you only get one wish, wishing for more wishes is pointless, because all you'll ever do is wish for another wish, right? So I only can get wish, and I can only wish for one more wish. Well, that's an endless game, right? And that's sort of the game of capital, right? It's like, well, I want more money. Well, why do you want more money? Well, so I can make more money. Well, why do you want more money? And it becomes a positive feedback loop where it never ends. So you're just gaining all these wishes, but they can't be spent on anyone. And capital is worthless if it's not actualized in an asset of some sort. If it's not actualized in some sort of good or service, or that's the whole point of having capital, is to be able to use it on assets. And so when you constantly say, well, I'm going to use my capital, make more capital, make more capital, make more capital, you sort of get this point where, like, well, I now have infinite wishes and I don't really know what to do with them because I can get anything or nothing, or, it becomes meaningless. And so, the right thing to do is take your wish and then find something really, really valuable and wish for that. Right. And that's sort of the problem I have with sort of where we're at in the world, where everyone thinks the right thing to do, because the obvious thing to do is wish for more wishes. But you're like, wishes themselves are worthless. Like, wishes themselves have no value. Yeah. It's just a wish. What you really want is whatever the wish is supposed to get you, which is like and then, if I were to make a morality table, this like Aladdin or something, like what you actually want to do is earn that thing, right? That's like the better way to do it, is earn the princess's love rather than trying to wish your way into her good graces. And, and then that's where we're at as a society. I think it's like everyone kind of sees the power of capital and of money, and it just goes, well, I want that, and I want what it can get me, but what I'm going to keep using it for is infinite time. So, what I'd rather see people do is think about, what is it I really want? Okay. And is there a way to get that? Like, there's all sorts of ways to go about that, just like Aladdin and the princess, without what you want. So like what I'll talk to some people about sometimes is they'll be like, I really want money. I'm like, why? And they're like, well, so I can go on a nice vacation, right? And you're like, why? And you're like, so I can spend time with my kid. And you're like, okay, what you could do is
just spend more time.
Forgo all that, right? Working extra hours, going over them, and just cut to spending time with your kid, and then you get what you actually want without all the extra steps, right? And so the same thing with your creativity. It's like, what do I really want? It's like, well, to make whatever, right? It's like, okay, well, then you go, well, in order to do that, I have to go to Hollywood. I have to go. It's like, or you could kind of cut out all that and just make it, right? You could just kind of skip the line, in a certain extent.
Yeah, and that's probably a good place for us to get off.
I think so.
Or end up.
Yeah, my
finish
cat.
This conversation.
I'm shocked at your restraint and not commenting on the cat joining the.
Trust me, several thoughts came into my head, and I thought about making jokes a couple times there, but
she just decided. I was this whole call pushing her down, and then she's just like, no. So I'm like, all right, well, I have a cat now for half this call.
Well, hey man, this one was good. We don't have much to show for this week. We were talking, it was crazy. So next week I expect we'll have something a bit more. But it was a good call, and sweet. Let's do it next week.
All right, sounds good. I'm going to play our outro.
Oh, we have an outro.